You're waiting for something to change, aren't you? Waiting to feel different, waiting for that surge of energy, that click in your mind, that sudden clarity where everything makes sense and you finally feel ready to do what you know you need to do. You've been telling yourself the same story for weeks, maybe months, maybe years. When I feel motivated, I'll start. When I have the energy, I'll begin. When the moment is right, when the conditions are perfect, when I finally feel like it, then I'll take action. And so you wait. You scroll through videos looking for inspiration. You read quotes. You imagine the person you'll be once you get started. You make plans. You set dates. You promise yourself that tomorrow will be different. But tomorrow comes and you still don't feel it. You still don't have that fire. You still don't feel motivated. And so you wait another day and another. And the thing you want to do, the thing you know you should do, the thing that would actually change your life, it stays undone. Not because you can't do it, but because you're waiting. Waiting for a feeling that you've convinced yourself has to come first. Waiting for motivation like it's some external force that will arrive and possess you and carry you into action. And meanwhile, your life is passing. The days are accumulating. The gap between who you are and who you want to be is widening. And underneath all of this waiting is a quiet desperation, a sense that time is running out, that you're wasting your potential, that you're letting yourself down. But still, you wait, because you don't know any other way. What if I told you that you're waiting for something that doesn't exist the way you think it does? What if motivation isn't what you've been taught it is? What if it's not a prerequisite for action, but a result of it? What if you've got the whole thing backwards? What if the very act of waiting for motivation is what's keeping you stuck, and the way forward has nothing to do with feeling motivated at all? What if you could act without it? What if you could begin without that surge of energy, without that feeling of readiness, without any of the conditions you think you need? What if the secret isn't about becoming the kind of person who feels motivated, but about becoming the kind of person who acts regardless of how they feel? And what if that shift, that movement from waiting to acting, what if that's where your power has been hiding all along? Not in the feeling, but in the choice. Not in the motivation, but in the movement. Not in waiting until you're ready, but in beginning before you are. Let me sit with this with you for a while, because this goes deeper than it appears. This isn't just about productivity or getting things done. This is about understanding the nature of action, the nature of change, the nature of how we actually move from one state to another. We've been sold a story about motivation. The story goes like this: successful people, productive people, people who accomplish things, they have something you don't have. They have motivation. They wake up feeling driven. They're naturally energized. They want to do the work. And if you could just figure out how to get that feeling, if you could just unlock that motivation, then you'd be able to do what they do. So you look for it. You try to manufacture it. You watch motivational videos. You read inspiring books. You imagine your future self. You think about your goals, all in an attempt to generate that feeling. And sometimes it works briefly. Sometimes you get a hit of motivation. You feel energized for an hour, maybe a day. And in that window, you take action. You start the project, you go to the gym, you work on the goal, and it feels good, it feels right. This is it, you think. This is how it's supposed to feel. But then the feeling fades, the motivation evaporates, and you're back to baseline, back to not feeling like it, back to waiting for the next hit. This is the trap. This is the cycle that keeps you stuck, because you've made feeling motivated the condition for taking action. You've made how you feel more important than what you do. And as long as that's your operating system, as long as you're waiting for the right feeling before you move, you'll always be at the mercy of your emotional state. And your emotional state, let me tell you, is not reliable. It changes constantly. It's influenced by your sleep, your diet, your stress levels, the weather,
random fluctuations in your neurochemistry, things you can't control and can't predict. And if you're waiting for your emotions to line up perfectly before you act, you're giving control of your life to forces that are fundamentally unstable. You're making yourself a passenger waiting for the right conditions instead of creating them. You're hoping something external will change so you can finally do what's internal. And that's backwards. That's why you're stuck. Now let's look at what actually happens when people accomplish things. When people build businesses, create art, transform their bodies, develop skills, achieve goals, do they do it because they're always motivated? Do they do it because they always feel like it? No. They do it because they've learned something crucial. They've learned that action comes first and feeling follows. They've learned that you don't wait to feel like doing something. You do it, and then you feel like you did it. They've learned that motivation is not the cause of action. It's the effect. And this is the inversion, the shift in perspective that changes everything. You think motivation leads to action, but actually action leads to motivation. You think you need to feel energized before you start, but actually starting is what creates the energy. You think you need to be ready, but actually you become ready by beginning before you are. Think about momentum for a moment. A boulder sitting on the ground takes enormous force to move.
Starting from stillness, from rest, that first push is the hardest. But once the boulder is moving, even just a little, it becomes easier to keep it moving. It builds momentum, and the more it moves, the easier the movement becomes. And eventually it's rolling on its own, and you're just guiding it rather than pushing it. That's how action works. The first movement is the hardest. Taking the first step when you feel nothing, when you have no energy, when you don't want to, that takes everything. It takes will, it takes choice. It takes you acting against your feelings, against your impulses, against the voice that says, wait until you feel better. But once you take that first step, something shifts. The second step is slightly easier, the third step easier still. And before long, you're moving. And once you're moving, motivation shows up. Not because you summoned it, but because movement creates it. Because action generates its own energy. Because beginning, even badly, even reluctantly, even half-heartedly, begins to shift your state. Your brain starts to engage with the task. Your body starts to wake up. And the thing that felt impossible when you were sitting still starts to feel possible now that you're in motion. This is what people who accomplish things understand. They don't wait for motivation. They create it through action. They know that the feeling will come once they start, so they just start. They don't make a big deal about it. They don't wait for the perfect moment. They don't need to feel inspired. They just do the next small thing. They open the document, they put on their shoes, they pick up the instrument. Whatever the first tiny action is, they do it. Not because they feel like it, but because it's time. Because they said they would. Because it's on the schedule. And that first action, that first movement, it's like lighting a match. It's small. It's barely anything, but it's enough to start a fire, enough to create light where there was darkness, enough to begin the process of transformation from still to moving, from waiting to doing, from potential to actual. Let me tell you what waiting for motivation actually is. It's a form of resistance. It's your system trying to protect you from discomfort. Because taking action, especially action that matters, especially action that could change things, is uncomfortable. It requires you to face uncertainty. It requires you to risk failing. It requires you to confront the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And your nervous system doesn't like that. Your nervous system wants you safe, comfortable, unchanged. So it creates resistance. And that resistance takes many forms. Procrastination, distraction. And the story that you need to wait for motivation, that story is seductive because it sounds reasonable. It sounds like you're being responsible, like you're waiting for the right conditions. But actually, you're just avoiding, you're just finding a sophisticated reason to stay still. And the longer you wait, the more sophisticated the reasons become.
You convince yourself that you need to be in the right headspace. You need to have energy. You need to feel ready. You build an entire belief system around the necessity of feeling motivated before you act, and that belief system becomes a prison, a comfortable prison where you never have to face the discomfort of beginning, but where you also never actually begin. Breaking out of that prison doesn't require you to somehow generate motivation. It requires you to see through the story, to recognize that waiting for motivation is just resistance wearing a disguise. And once you see that, once you understand that the voice telling you to wait is not wisdom but fear, you can make a different choice. You can choose to act anyway. Not because you feel like it, but because you've decided to. Not because it's easy, but because it matters. Not because you're motivated, but because you're committed. And commitment, real commitment, doesn't depend on how you feel. Commitment is the decision to do something regardless of your emotional state. Commitment is saying, this is what I do, this is who I am, and then doing it whether you feel inspired or exhausted, whether you feel confident or terrified, whether you feel motivated or completely flat. Commitment creates consistency, and consistency creates results, and results create momentum, and momentum creates motivation. See how it works? The motivation comes at the end of the chain, not the beginning, but we've been taught to start with it, to wait for it, and that's why we stay stuck. Now let's talk about what happens when you shift your relationship with action. When you stop making feeling motivated a prerequisite and start just doing what needs to be done. At first it's hard, it feels forced, it feels like you're going through the motions, like you're faking it. And you are, in a way. You're acting as if you're the kind of person who does this thing, even though you don't feel like that person yet. You're showing up even though you don't want to. You're taking action even though it feels hollow. And that's okay. That's part of the process, because what you're doing is building a new pattern. You're teaching your system that action doesn't require motivation. You're proving to yourself that you can move without the feeling. And every time you do it, every time you act without feeling like it, you strengthen that capacity. You build the muscle of will. You develop the ability to choose your actions instead of being controlled by your feelings. And that ability, that capacity to act independently of your emotional state, that's freedom, real freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you feel like, which is actually slavery to your impulses, but the freedom to do what you've decided to do, regardless of what you feel. That's power. That's agency. That's being the author of your life instead of a character being pushed around by moods and circumstances. And here's what's beautiful. After you've been doing this for a while, after you've consistently acted without waiting for motivation, something changes. The resistance diminishes. The gap between deciding to do something and actually doing it shrinks. It starts to feel more natural, not easy necessarily, but natural. Like this is just what you do. Like you're someone who writes every morning or exercises or practices or whatever your thing is. And you don't need motivation anymore because you're not relying on it. You're operating from identity, not from emotion. You're not asking, do I feel like doing this? You're just doing it because this is what people like you do. This is who you are. And that identity, that sense of yourself as someone who acts regardless of feelings, that's more stable than any motivation, because motivation comes and goes, but identity persists. Motivation is a feeling, but identity is a structure. And once you've built that structure, once you've become someone who doesn't wait, you're free. Free from the tyranny of moods, free from the endless cycle of waiting and hoping and trying to manufacture feelings that may never come. You're just someone who does what they said they'd do. And that simplicity, that directness, it's liberating. Let me talk about the relationship between action and awareness, because there's something subtle here that's worth exploring. When you're waiting for motivation, you're living in your head. You're thinking about doing the thing instead of doing it. You're imagining how it will feel, planning how it will go, rehearsing what you'll do when you finally start. And all of that mental activity feels like progress, but it's not. It's just spinning. It's just your mind creating the illusion of movement while you stay perfectly still. But when you actually take action, when you stop thinking about it and start doing it, something shifts. You drop out of your head and into your body. You become present with what is instead of what might be. And that presence, that engagement with actual reality, instead of imagined scenarios, that's where life happens. That's where change happens. Not in the planning, not in the waiting, not in the thinking about it, but in the doing, in the actual contact with the work, in the friction of reality meeting intention. And that friction, that contact, it's uncomfortable sometimes. It doesn't always feel good, but it's real. And real is what you need. Real is what creates transformation. Fantasizing about transformation doesn't transform you. Acting does. There's a teaching in Zen about chopping wood and carrying water. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. What this points to is the ordinariness of the spiritual life, the ordinariness of a life well lived. It's not about peak experiences or special states or feeling motivated and inspired all the time. It's about doing what needs to be done. Before you understand this, you chop wood and carry water. After you understand this, you chop wood and carry water. The action is the same. What changes is your relationship to it. You stop waiting for it to feel special. You stop needing it to be exciting. You just do it because it's what's in front of you. And that ordinariness, that acceptance of the mundane, that's where peace lives. Not in achieving some elevated state where you always feel motivated, but in accepting that most of life is just chopping wood and carrying water, just showing up to the work, just doing the next thing, and finding meaning not in how it feels, but in the doing itself. So what does this mean practically? How do you shift from waiting for motivation to acting without it? You start small, smaller than you think you need to. You don't commit to writing a book, you commit to writing one sentence. You don't commit to running a marathon, you commit to putting on your shoes. You don't commit to transforming your life. You commit to doing one small thing differently today. And you do it without negotiating with yourself, without checking how you feel, without asking if you want to. You just do it, like brushing your teeth, like getting dressed. You don't wait to feel motivated to brush your teeth. You just do it because it's part of your routine, part of being a functional human. And you can bring that same quality to other actions. This is what I do. This is who I am. I write. I exercise. I practice. Not when I feel like it, just in general, as a feature of my life. And when the time comes to do it, I do it. I don't debate it. I don't wait for a feeling. I just begin. And once I begin, the rest takes care of itself. There's something about beginning that's almost magical. The first word written, the first step taken, the first note played, it breaks the spell of inertia. It proves that you can move. It demonstrates that you're not stuck. And that proof, that evidence that you can act independently of your feelings, it accumulates. Each time you do it, you're adding to a body of evidence that you're someone who follows through, someone who doesn't need perfect conditions, someone who can be counted on by yourself and others to do what they said they'd do. And that reputation, that track record, it becomes self-reinforcing. You start to trust yourself. You start to believe that when you commit to something, you'll do it. And that self-trust, that's foundational. That's what allows you to take on bigger challenges, to commit to longer timelines, to believe in your own capacity to see things through. Because you have proof. Not proof that you're always motivated, but proof that you don't need to be. Proof that you can act anyway. Now, I want to address something you might be thinking, but isn't this just forcing yourself? Isn't this just grinding through life without joy? Isn't this denying your feelings and becoming a machine? And I understand that concern, because there's a kind of forcing that is damaging, a kind of pushing through that's violent, a kind of ignoring your feelings that leads to burnout. But that's not what I'm describing. I'm not talking about overriding your genuine need for rest. I'm not talking about pushing yourself to exhaustion. I'm not talking about ignoring your body's signals that something is wrong. I'm talking about recognizing the difference between genuine limitation and simple resistance, between I need to rest because I'm actually depleted and I don't feel like it right now, between I can't because I'm injured and I can't because it's uncomfortable. There's a quality of attention required here, a quality of discernment. You have to learn to listen to yourself accurately, to distinguish between the voice of wisdom that says stop, rest, you need recovery, and the voice of resistance that says you don't have to do this today, you can wait until you feel better. And that discernment comes through practice, through acting and noticing what happens, through resting and noticing what happens, through developing a relationship with yourself that's honest and attentive rather than driven by arbitrary rules. But here's what I've found. Most of us vastly overestimate how often we truly need rest, and vastly underestimate how often we're just experiencing resistance. Most of the time when we say we're too tired, we're not too tired to act. We're just used to waiting for energy we don't need. Most of the time when we say we'll do it later when we feel better, later feels exactly the same. Because the feeling we're waiting for isn't coming. It's not a real thing. It's an excuse our resistance generates to keep us safe, to keep us unchanged. And the only way to discover this is to experiment, to try acting without the feeling and see what happens, to notice that you can do the thing even when you don't want to discover that the doing itself generates energy, generates interest, generates a kind of satisfaction that waiting never provides. And once you discover that, once you prove it to yourself through experience, the waiting becomes optional. You see through it, you recognize it for what it is, and you choose differently. Let's explore what it feels like to act without motivation, to just begin when you don't want to. There's often a heaviness at first, a sense of resistance. Your body doesn't want to move. Your mind generates reasons why you should wait. Just 5 more minutes. Just until after this video. Just until you feel a bit better. And you can engage with that voice, or you can simply move anyway. And when you move anyway, when you stand up and walk to your desk or your yoga mat or wherever your work lives, something interesting happens. The resistance doesn't disappear, but it becomes less solid. It becomes something you're moving through rather than something that's stopping you. Like walking through fog. The fog doesn't go away just because you're walking, but you're moving through it. You're making progress. And sometimes, after a few minutes of being in motion, the fog lifts. The resistance dissolves. And you find yourself actually engaged with what you're doing. Not because you forced yourself to feel engaged, but because engagement emerged from the doing. Other times the resistance stays the whole time. The fog doesn't lift. And you complete your session or your work or whatever it is, and it felt like pulling teeth the whole way. And that's okay too, because you did it. You proved that you can. You added to your evidence that you're someone who follows through, regardless of how it feels. And that's valuable. That's building something. There's a kind of maturity in this, a kind of growing up. Children act based on how they feel. If they don't feel like doing something, they don't do it. If they want something, they pursue it. They're completely governed by impulse and emotion. And that's appropriate for children. They're learning about their feelings, learning to identify them, learning that they exist. But adults, mature adults, they've learned something else. They've learned that feelings are information, not commands, that you can acknowledge a feeling without obeying it, that you can feel tired and still act, feel scared and still move forward, feel unmotivated and still show up. And that capacity, that ability to have a feeling without being controlled by it, that's emotional maturity. That's self-mastery. Not mastery in the sense of domination, but mastery in the sense of skillful relationship. You're not at war with your feelings. You're not suppressing them or pretending they don't exist. You're just not letting them make all your decisions. You're the one making decisions, and you're making them based on your values, your commitments, your vision for who you want to be, not based on your momentary emotional state. And here's where it gets paradoxical. When
You stop needing to feel motivated before you act, when you become someone who just does what needs to be done regardless of feelings, you actually start to feel more motivated more often. Not because you're trying to generate motivation, but because you're living in alignment with your values, because you're keeping your word to yourself, because you're building self-trust and self-respect through your actions. And those things, that alignment and trust and respect, they create a kind of stable, positive state that's more reliable than motivation. It's not the peak feeling of inspiration. It's not the rush of excitement. It's something quieter but deeper. It's the satisfaction of being someone you respect, of living with integrity, of doing what you said you'd do. And that satisfaction, that quiet sense of rightness, it's more valuable than any spike of motivation, because it's sustainable, because it's self-generated, because it doesn't depend on external circumstances or random
fluctuations in your neurochemistry. It depends on your choices, and your choices are within your control. Let me talk about the myth of waiting for the right time, because this is closely related to waiting for motivation. The belief that there's a right time to start, and now isn't it? You'll start when you have more time, more money, more energy, more knowledge, more support, more clarity. You'll start when the conditions are better, when things settle down, when you're not so busy, when you're not so stressed, when life gets easier. But here's the truth: the right time doesn't come. Life doesn't get easier. The conditions don't become perfect. There's never a moment when everything aligns and all the obstacles disappear and the path is clear. If you're waiting for that, you'll wait forever. Because that's not how life works. Life is always complicated, always messy, always full of competing demands and imperfect circumstances. And if you're waiting for it to be different before you start, you're not waiting for the right time. You're waiting for a time that will never come. The right time is always now, not because now is perfect, but because now is what you have. Now is real, and you can act now, even in imperfect circumstances, even without ideal conditions. You can begin with what you have, where you are, as you are, and that beginning, that decision to start now instead of waiting for later, that's where everything changes. Think about a garden. If you're waiting for the perfect weather to plant seeds, you'll never plant anything, because the weather is never perfect. It's always too hot or too cold, too wet or too dry, too something. But gardeners don't wait for perfect weather. They work with the weather they have. They plant when it's planting season, even if conditions aren't ideal. And they trust that the seeds will grow if they're tended, if they're watered and weeded and cared for. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They just have to be workable. And they're almost always workable if you're willing to work with them. And your life is like that. The conditions are never perfect, but they're workable. You can start now. You can plant seeds now. You can tend them now. And if you do, something will grow. Maybe not exactly what you expected, maybe not as fast as you hoped, but something real, something that wouldn't exist if you kept waiting. So, what's the alternative to waiting for motivation? It's deciding, it's commitment, it's choosing. Not choosing to feel motivated, because you can't choose feelings, but choosing to act, choosing your identity, choosing to be someone who does this thing, and then acting from that choice, from that decision, from that commitment, regardless of how you feel. And here's what's powerful about this. When you make a real decision, when you truly commit, you cut off other options. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop leaving the back door open. You stop making your action conditional on your feelings. You just decide, this is what I'm doing, this is who I am, and then you do it. Not perfectly, not with certainty about the outcome, but with certainty about your commitment.
And that certainty, that decision, it simplifies everything. You're not asking yourself every day whether you feel like it. You're not constantly redeciding. You decided, and now you're just executing that decision. And that removes so much mental energy that was being wasted on the constant negotiation. Now that energy is available for the actual work. If you're hearing this, if something in these words is landing, I want to invite you to make a gesture, not a commitment to transform your entire life overnight, but a small gesture toward the person you're becoming. Like this video, subscribe to this channel. Not because I need you to, but because that small action, that tiny commitment, it's practice. It's you acting without waiting for the perfect feeling. It's you choosing instead
of deliberating. And if you can do it in this small way, you can do it in bigger ways. You can start applying this to the things that actually matter, to the work you've been avoiding, to the changes you've been postponing, to the life you've been waiting to live. The practice is the same. Notice the resistance, notice the voice that says, wait, and then move anyway, gently, without force, but with certainty, with the quiet knowledge that you don't need to feel ready to begin. You just need to begin, and the readiness, if it comes at all, comes after. As we close, I want to leave you with something to carry. You are not broken for not feeling motivated. You are not lazy. You are not lacking something essential that other people have. You are simply waiting for something that doesn't work the way you think it does. You've been taught that motivation comes first and action follows. But it's the other way around. Action comes first, motivation follows, or it doesn't. And either way, the action is what matters. The action is what creates change. The action is what builds the life you want. Not the feeling, not the inspiration, not the perfect conditions. The action. And you can take action right now. Not because you feel like it. Not because you're ready, not because everything is aligned, but because you're choosing to, because you're deciding to be someone who acts instead of someone who waits. And that decision, renewed moment by moment, day by day, that's what creates transformation. Not dramatic, not all at once, but real, lasting, built on the foundation of choices you made when you didn't feel like it, when it was hard, when you could have waited, but didn't. Those are the moments that matter. Those are the moments that define who you become. So stop waiting. Stop looking for the feeling that will make it easy. Stop postponing your life until you feel ready. Just begin. Begin small. Begin scared. Begin tired. Begin without knowing how it will go. Just begin. The beginning is everything. And you don't need motivation for it. You just need the willingness to take one step without knowing what the next step will be. One action without guaranteeing the outcome. One moment of choosing yourself, your values, your vision over your feelings. And then another moment. And another. That's all it takes. Not motivation, just movement. Just the quiet decision, made again and again, to show up, to act. To live, not someday when you feel like it. Now, while you're tired, while you're uncertain, while you're still not sure. Now is when you begin. And the beginning, imperfect as it is everything.